essentially, which is the Tulsi Gabbard revision of the impeachment, Oath Keepers, and there's a guy who's running the FBI that's kind of trying to sue the shit out of everybody. So let's start with the Tulsi 2019 thing, since that's old news, right?
We thought, I have been expecting more on it for quite some time. I mean, look, the only reason that I have been given about why I lost my security clearance the first time last year was because of my representation of the intelligence community whistleblower back in 2019, 2020. I mean, there were a lot of reasons why I crossed paths with Trump and his administration, numerous cases, but that was the one that was highlighted by folks as to why I was a threat. Not even a current, right? A retribution.
Right.
And we have always expected in this administration from day one, as was proven to be the case, that there was going to be further retribution, right? It didn't happen during the first administration, quite frankly. Whatever we did, I didn't feel, I got death threats, things like that, but not from the government. That was from just crazy drunk people all around the country. But this administration is completely different. These are targeted attacks, especially on lawyers, because this is all about Henry VI, Dick the Butcher. For those who don't remember, the notion of the first thing we do is kill all the lawyers. That's not a derogatory term towards my brethren and sisterin and whatever the co-word is. It's a compliment. It was because lawyers would uphold the rule of law and get in the way of any despots who were trying to overthrow the king. And so that's a reason why I've been targeted particularly. It's a reason why the law firms were targeted, for work that lawyers who don't even work at those law firms any longer had done in the first administration. So, I haven't seen anything in the files that have been released, all of which I was a part of from almost the beginning.
You talk about Tulsi's press announcement?
Yeah, the documents that she declassified, most of which I don't even think were classified, but they were. I'll tell you what the bigger message is. This is, again, proof of why we don't trust the Inspector General system right now, because those were Inspector General protected documents, not classified. Remember, Trump declassified the whistleblower complaint. Trump declassified the summary transcript of his conversation with Zelensky.
Right.
The interviews then would be collateral. They'd be derivative of the same information. So classification wasn't the issue. It was protecting the integrity and the structure of the Inspector General system, which had protected the anonymity of the whistleblower and anyone else who had been interviewed, which makes them whistleblowers as well by way of deriving protection under the law from retaliation. So the fact that she, as the DNI, who does not control the Inspector General, right? The Attorney General of the United States doesn't control the Department of Justice Inspector General. The Secretary of Defense doesn't control the Defense Department's Inspector General. They are supposed to be independent individuals. And this shows they're not at all, because the release of this information is entirely to make anyone who was associated look bad and to try and refabricate the history of what we know happened the first time around. And, the facts were made clear. I mean, you don't need the internal documents. You can go online and just find the whistleblower complaint and find the summary transcript. And maybe you read it and you go, I don't see anything that's such a big deal. Okay, clearly the majority of the Senate thought that, not worthy of impeachment, at least in that context, not high crimes and misdemeanors. Or you could look at it and go, this is the most inappropriate thing. This is a high crime and misdemeanor worthy of of being removed from office or prosecuted had the decision been made.
Exactly.
And as we know, now they have referred, Tulsi Gabbard has referred both the whistleblower, who I no longer represent, and the former Inspector General, Michael Atkinson, for criminal prosecution. Whether myself and my co-counsel who represented the whistleblower have been referred for prosecution, we don't know. But it, frankly, wouldn't surprise me.
Yeah, and I wrote this article the other day on this. The Trump cult minion Gabbard is lying again, and I went through because I'm a little obsessed with that era of the impeachment. One, strangely enough, I was in front of the Capitol building the night they started the impeachment in January 2020. I went there for a PSYOP workshop I was teaching, and then I said I'm gonna go down to the Capitol. And it was the opening night of the impeachment. It was very intense, but I didn't know I would be in Ukraine. I had no concept I would be where I'm at now in Kiev, where I don't know, weapons supplies, the security of our skies, things like that matter. Um, so reading it all again, it's in her own press release. There were things in her own press release that were clearly, as you mentioned in the previous disclosed papers, of the perfect phone call, all that stuff that was put out contemporaneous, because I have it in a folder that's not new and not super secret.
No, so they are, from what I have seen, and other than actually this discussion right now, nobody in mainstream media has really focused on this. It has only been right-wing MAGA
Mm,
who are pushing the narrative.
mhm.
I mean, nobody contacted me from the media on either side, other than conversations behind the scenes that I had with reporters or and scheduling this. But they're rehashing all the same information that was back in the day.
Mm,
Oh, the whistleblower didn't have firsthand information. Nobody said the whistleblower had firsthand information.
correct.
Wasn't required. No whistleblower complaints require firsthand information. That's a very basic function of whistleblowing. You have to have a reasonable good faith belief. And the whistleblower had been briefed as part of their official government responsibilities of the phone call. That happens
Hmm.
every time a president of the United States has a conversation with a foreign diplomat, a president, whatever whoever they're talking to, right? If the president of the United States talks to the Bolivian president and the subject of bananas comes up for export, and hey, we need to do the tariff, whatever, the people at the agriculture department get briefed on
Hmm.
it.
Hmm.
Some GS-13 is not going to be on the phone call or in the White House Oval Office listening to the president to president conversation. Someone
Right.
from the White House will brief them because it's going to impact them. The Commerce Department, the State Department, it gets farmed out to all the different agencies. So that's how this intelligence officer found out about it. And they talk about, they're highlighting that other people came in who had bias and things like that. No, there was a credibility determination to verify, is the whistleblower who they say they are? Is the
Hmm.
information that they're recounting accurate? And again,
Hmm.
you can read the frickin' summary transcript. It matches the whistleblower complaint. And then
Hmm.
once the whistleblower did that, they were, as we argued at the time, irrelevant. There's nothing more for them to add. Then it goes to Congress. That was the oversight authority. And then Congress did whatever it wanted with it. It held hearings, it did investigations, and ultimately impeached the president of the United States, but failed to convict. That's the process.
I mean, in leaning into the second pillar of what I'm concerned about, which is, and thanks for joining us on these questions, because I've been trying to get a series of the types of the puzzle pieces our government runs around. So we had Frank Figluzzi on the other day. That's the investigation side. We may have Glenn Kirshner come up, who's the prosecution side, but you have a very different role in all of these histories. Especially, you have a very specific role in a lot of these histories, and The second case that's similar to this that's really disturbed us that we had on the plate was trying to release the oath keepers from any wrongdoing. Essentially, I mean, my understanding is the sentence would remain, but it vacates all of the consequences and opens them up for some reclamation of funds from the government, from taxpayers. But you represent people involved in what the consequences of what they did as well. So let's talk about that for a bit.
All right. So I watched what happened on January 6th live, as so many people did. And
Hmm.
within a very short period of time, I started representing one of the top intelligence officers at the Capitol Police Department. They have a very small intel unit, but they have one for obvious reasons, probably that no one needs to have explained to them. They're
Hmm.
guarding the Capitol and members of Congress, right? They need to know intelligence. They're not the primary. The Bureau is predominantly the primary, but they work with law enforcement around the country to gather intel, and they do their own. So she was a whistleblower. She reported things to the Inspector General's office about what she had learned, how things were handled, how things were mishandled. I then started to represent Harry Dunn, who was the first Capitol Police officer to speak out in the media. And he was as a whistleblower. And my primary role was, he wasn't in trouble for anything. It was to make sure that he, and then later Sergeant Aquilino Ganell, who was injured seriously, had to medically retire because of his injuries suffered that day, that they could speak to the media and to Congress without any retribution, retaliation, or concern, which
Right.
totally worked. We always made sure that what they did, including their writing of books, that everything was approved. It was cleared, right? No one was going around or circumventing rules and
Hmm.
regulations. I also represent the estate of Officer Brian Sicknick, who died
That's
in
right.
the aftermath. And, the right wing MAGA will blow their top about, nobody died that day. Certainly no Capitol Police officers. And, he just had a heart attack or a stroke. Okay. Yeah. You don't think that was related to it? Could someone have just dropped dead the next day? Yeah, of course. But it was obviously related. The guy was
Yeah.
injured that day. And, some officers killed themselves in the aftermath of what they went through, the trauma they went through. That's all connected. Hey, and we'll let who's actually responsible from a legal standpoint to the litigation that we have against President Trump, which was authorized the other day to continue into
Yeah, yeah.
possible discovery, and to take his deposition. It is on the table. We can see the door. Don't know if we'll
Hmm.
actually get there. Might be locked when we get there, but we can see the door. Now, there were something like 1,500 cases brought against those who committed crimes on January 6th.
Hmm.
Um, those ranged from just clearly mere trespassing into the Capitol to sedition, of
Right.
trying to overthrow the U.S. government. Interspersed in that were individuals who physically harmed police officers, whether Metropolitan DC police and or Capitol police officers, very seriously. Like I said, some had to medically retire as a result.
That's right.
And President Trump, of course, ran on that he was going to pardon everybody. I think most people, including the Republicans, thought, well, he's only going to talk about the people who were just trespassing, who just got caught up in the moment, and just when people smashed through the windows, smashed through the doors, they just strolled in. And I would probably say the vast majority of them did nothing destructive. They just walked around and looked stupid taking selfies as part of a riot, but still a crime. And if that had been the pardons, I think most people would have just gone, okay, because they served their time, right? It's not like you can take back that they were in jail for whatever period of time,
Right.
or still have the smear, the public stain of being identified as having been one of those people. But
Right.
he went further. He pardoned everybody other than the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys, including the people who literally tried to kill police officers. And that set back,
He
obviously, a lot.
threatened his vice president, no less.
Yeah, right. Who would have, right? They had a gallows to hang Mike Pence. And I wouldn't have doubted, had they found him or Nancy Pelosi, that there would have
That's right.
been political legislative bloodshed. He commuted the sentences of the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys. They had some of the longest sentences. I want to say 18 years for sure. I'm trying to think of, I think there might have been one into the 20s of years, but really significant sentences. Notably, some of those guys weren't even present physically on January 6th at the Capitol, but they had organized people to go. They had secured weaponry. I mean, first of all, there were weapons that day, but they had at a separate site in Virginia actual guns and other weapons ready to go if they were going to literally.
Yeah, they had, for our viewers, they had what was called a quick reaction force, a QRF, on cue, and it was at I believe, a Comfort Inn location just outside of the perimeter, which is interesting because they wanted to obey the gun laws of
Yeah,
DC.
right, because in Virginia you can have weapons a lot easier, but in
Yeah.
DC it's very strict.
But it's well in the evidence that they did all of these things. It's
Yeah.
extreme. I mean, for the
No
viewers who
debate.
might not know my background, like that's what I was working on the entire time, and I've been through the data. I have the data sitting here on my desktop, no less. Every frame of it, every receipt, all the evidence is sitting there, and that's the part that's kind of surreal about where we're at with all of this.
Yeah, and so commutation, for those who don't know the difference with pardons, that meant the sentence is over. They were still convicted of the crime, unlike those who were pardoned. That legally relieves anyone of any type of liability. So, they wouldn't have to put it on their record. They could still vote, whatever other consequences, no probation, things like that. And now the Justice Department has filed a motion with the DC Circuit seeking to vacate the conviction, send it back to the district court, which would wipe it out completely. Why in the world would that be done? It's dumbfounding. I don't think there is a way to understand anyone who is a conservative Republican who in my lifetime was the party that supported the blue, that backed the blue, right? Supported law enforcement, to think that these individuals who conspired to overthrow the US government, who are part of, for some, militias, who don't even acknowledge the existence of actual government,
Right.
and advocated for the harming of police officers. And yet this administration is just willing to. I lose words every time I try and discuss this because I'm so disgusted by it. Like I said, if they had just pardoned the trespassers, whatever, most of them learned their lesson. I mean, there's been a ton of people who have committed crimes who were convicted that day. I mean, the bad guys. There were a lot of bad people there, but there were a lot of people who were just trying to protest, and they got swept up in the moment.
A lot of guys that did that, they went out and committed even more crimes after they got released and pardoned. Went out and created even more chaos in our society, which I think is the point.
Threatening to kill FBI agents. One guy was and he tried to argue, I think he failed on it, that the pardon applied to his other weapons charges associated with threatening to kill FBI agents.
Well, speaking of FBI agents, like there's a guy who's been in the news in the last few days, threatening to sue the Atlantic. And my understanding is that you're representing there's a batch of officers or former officials, I guess would probably be the best term, who are in fact suing back for inappropriate dismissal. Yes.
Well, so different combining. All right.
Go for it.
So Kash Patel has now sued the Atlantic and the reporter who wrote the story, which essentially says there are concerns, many people, multiple sources, 9 to 2 dozen sources at times, depending on the allegation, that he's got drinking issues and that his
Mhm.
drinking has interfered with his job. I'll tell you outright, much of what I saw in the story were things that we had already heard. Like it wasn't surely publicly known, but for those of us who are representing FBI officials who are in that community, yeah, this was circulating within those communities. So I represent quite a number of FBI analysts and agents who have been fired, who have been targeted, who are concerned of being fired, who are whistleblowers of what's going on within the Bureau. And
Mhm.
those lawsuits we have, in fact, in one of the lawsuits where I represent the former special agent in charge of Las Vegas, as well as in that lawsuit is the former acting director of the Bureau who preceded Patel, as well
Mhm.
as the uh, special agent in charge of the Washington field office, the largest of the field offices. And in that, there is an allegation we put that Patel had told one of them that that the FBI official should file a defamation lawsuit against anyone because that will muck up the works, and
Hmm.
that's a good strategy to be, which is unheard of. You never saw federal government officials, especially at that level, ever
No.
suing. I mean, come on, right? I mean, you're supposed to be able to take it. Could you imagine if James Comey had sued anyone, had sued Fox News, back in prior administrations? They would have
Yeah,
laughed.
and that's part of the overarching thing why I want the experience from you guys that have been at this for a while is to say, I hate to keep having to draw it back to the Bush and Cheney administration, but I remember kind of what they put through, some people through, journalists and lawyers, etc. My friend Valerie Plame and Joe Wilson. Um, and yet, this is such an order of magnitude different that it's a shit show on a shit show on top of a gaslight.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to yearn back for that time period. But look, even if you look back to the Nixon administration, I was a little kid, uh,
Yeah.
but I remember when he resigned, and they were career politicians who, while one could certainly question their moral integrity on certain issues and that they wouldn't necessarily follow the law if it didn't suit them, they followed norms. And
Hmm.
that's the difference in my view between this administration and past ones. This
Right.
administration throws every norm out the window. There is nothing that they think they cannot do. There is nothing that they do not think they are entitled to. Whereas
Yeah.
Nixon, the mere fact that he resigned was demonstrative of he knew what was not only better for him, but better for the United States.
Right.
Gerald Ford pardoning Nixon was not to help his friend Richard Nixon. It was because he believed it was better for the United States. And it's also why, before Bill Clinton recently testified in this bogus investigation involving Epstein with respect to, at least for Hillary. I mean, we can understand why people would want to talk to Bill Clinton, but to bring
Right.
a former president before Congress, the last time that happened was Gerald Ford, who willingly did it. And I'm not
Exactly.
even sure it happened before that. At least someone, maybe one of the viewers can remind me if there was an example in history besides now Ford and Clinton.
And so I think of I'm not a lawyer, but I'm a coding guy, and I grew up in a law firm. Is I think that both of us operate in a codified system that we might not know how to operate if the code had to change. So whereas there's a whole lot of other occupations that do not have to obey those rules at all, right? If I code poorly, I'm going to get a poor result. If I go in court and argue poorly, I'm probably going to get my ass handed to me. Um, but also that operates within a certain confines of a system that we anticipate will work. And now, for instance, our guest last night was Dakota Adams, and we last had our conversation when his dad was going to prison. You know, it was over. You know, and there was still this belief in a Department of Justice that would be one way, even on a terrible day. And now everything is upside down in the legal world. So how do guys like you, who are very coded into the legal world, function in this environment? That's my long way to get that question on the table.
So the one shining light that exists so far
Hmm.
is that the judiciary has continued to uphold the rule of law. That doesn't
Hmm.
mean every decision has gone every way that we want, because clearly they haven't. And that's fine. There is still a system in place. And judges, whether Democrat or Republican appointed, whether non-Trump or even Trump appointed, have continually at a significantly high level, something like 70%, have ruled against the administration. Again,
Hmm.
including judges Donald Trump appointed. You know,
Right.
we've seen it even on the Supreme Court, which is why he lashes out at the justices who rule against him, who
That's right.
include his own. And that, to me, that is, I would otherwise be powerless. What else am I going to do as a lawyer other than to bring these types of claims, right? I have no interest in going out, grabbing my AR-15 and, you know, taking on the federal government. That's not how things are done or should be done.
Right.
Uh, we use the rule of law to challenge the system and say what the executive branch is doing exceeds their constitutional authority. Unfortunately, the legislative branch, they checked out.
Right.
They're useless right now. We'll see what happens come midterms, although quite frankly, come January 2027, I'm still always concerned, because I'm not a political person, that the Democrats, you know, they better just make sure, if they're going to, for a bad analogy, because I did work on the Trump Butler assassination case representing Secret Service agents.
Mm.
If they're going to take their shot, they better not miss. And I say that figuratively by way of impeachment, of course.
Understood.
You know, if they don't, if the Democrats don't take the Senate, I honestly hope they do not try to impeach him in the House, because what good is that unless you've whipped the votes in the Senate? We'll see. You know, that's political. When I repped the whistleblower again in the first Trump impeachment,
Hmm.
we had 3 objectives: bring the information to the appropriate oversight authorities, protect the anonymity of the whistleblower, protect the whistleblower from retaliation. And we achieved
Hmm.
all 3 of those. Impeachment was not an objective. That was a political decision by Congress. That we didn't advocate for it. We didn't ask for it. We didn't participate in it. We stayed out of it. In fact, we pushed back. We pushed back against the Democrats who were in control of the House at the time. That's why you never saw the whistleblower testify. The whistleblower,
Right.
in fact, never even met with the committee, other than as was reported, in which they try and spin into a conspiracy story that he conspired with Adam Schiff, who was the chair of the House Select Committee. In fact, I see constantly where I conspired, they allege, with Adam Schiff to write the whistleblower complaint.
That's
I
right. I
didn't
remember.
I didn't even come into the case for 5 weeks
Right.
after the complaint had been filed. That was a colleague of mine who didn't see the whistleblower complaint until it was declassified and we all saw the complaint. But so the judges swinging back around, the judges are the shining light right now. And we'll see how long that holds. I mean, hopefully it'll continually hold. But
One viewer is asking, Mark, is Bradley Moss still working with you?
yes, yeah. Yeah, I saw one person was saying they like to see him on, I forget where they said. He used to go on Fox a lot. Beam would have her on in the 11 o'clock hour, but
Shannon Beam, yeah.
but it hasn't happened for a while. I don't know even know if Shannon is still on at that time. But no, Brad is still, he better be billing clients right now, because clearly I'm not billing anybody for talking here with everyone. No, and we've expanded the firm. We've got some other lawyers now who were former Army, both
Nice.
Army JAGs, Army intelligence officers, And the law firm is all about rule of law and accountability, not about politics, not about.
Well, I've got two pivots right there. Then actually, naturally, so we have a speaking of drunks at the FBI, we can talk about a drunk at the Pentagon. Are there shifts because of this nonstop war against Iran that's showing up in your realm? Anything about what's coming out of the military? Because now would be a time for whistleblowers to be saying there's a problem.
Yes, absolutely. So, yes, we've been contacted, for example, by military members who are concerned about illegal orders,
Hmm.
who are concerned about embarking on Iranian operations that may either lead to boots on the ground or even concerns of use of potentially nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
I co-founded Whistleblower Aid, which provides free legal representation to whistleblowers, especially where I get involved is in the national security military sector. I'm also a fellow at the National Institute of Military Justice, and they run the Orders Project, which is to provide assistance to military members who are concerned about whether an order is lawful or not and how to properly respond to an order that they view as unlawful.
Right.
And there have been some inquiries about Iran. There were more about Greenland. I mean,
Okay.
where
Good.
yeah,
Good.
good. Where military members were like, "I'm resigning and speaking out if we even go near Greenland, a NATO ally. Forget that."
Right.
Um, that's obviously quieted down because Squirrel, something distracted Trump, and he's moved on to the next item, which at the moment is Iran, and we'll see how long that lasts. Remember, I don't know if you remember.
Yeah.
Apparently, we went into Venezuela and we took the president of Venezuela, and then we were supposed to be running Venezuela, was my understanding. I don't even.
President of.
Do you ever even hear anything about Venezuela in the news any longer?
Nope. And also interesting, if you mentioned Butler, I also don't hear him endlessly wanting to talk about that event, even though it was so life changing for him. So
And it's interesting watching the right wing MAGA folks, the conspiracists, are starting to actually allege that it was a totally fake assassination
I
attempt.
saw that.
And which I find fascinating. Now, look, I represented the lead agent from the Pittsburgh field office on the ground, as well as the director of the Secret Service at the time. Butler was an actual assassination attempt. I have no doubts whatsoever about it. And there were issues and problems, obviously, as to why it happened that are institutional, systemic. There were a lot of people to blame as to how it happened. It was like the movie in the saying, The Perfect Storm. Just
Hmm.
everything that went wrong could have gone wrong, including a great deal on the locals, even though they pushed blame on the Secret Service. I sat through Senate investigations, House investigations, IG investigations, blue ribbon investigations. I heard pretty much all the evidence, and the locals had a lot to blame, without finger pointing to anyone. Because again, it was so many things that went wrong, and if any one of those hadn't, it wouldn't have happened. But they all just did.
Right.
But it's interesting to see the MAGA folks now turn not only on each other, but on Donald Trump. What that means, I don't know. It's kind of fun to watch. Tucker Carlson was apologizing
I
today or
saw it.
yesterday for getting Trump elected. He's constantly, he still praises Trump, praises Loomer, but, he'll attack Megyn Kelly, praise Mark Levin, but attack, you name it, just, whomever. Joe Rogan goes to the White House, but they're all criticizing one another now. And I saw today, Pam Bondi's, a former attorney general, her former chief of staff, Chad Mizell, who I dealt with when he was the general counsel of the Department of Homeland Security in the
Right.
first Trump administration.
Right.
He posted some comment today. I'll paraphrase, so hopefully I'm not too far off and he won't sue me for defamation or something. But he said something like the reason why the warfare,
Mhm.
politicization, the retribution against their perceived enemies isn't working is because they need to be MAGA and competent. They need both.
That second part is so hard to come by these days, you know?
Yes. Yeah. By the way,
Oh,
just to swing back around to Kash Patel's lawsuit, that lawsuit is going nowhere.
well,
That
that's actually where I was gonna go back to
yeah,
anyway,
will
because
lose.
there's a lawyer on the case, and so I wanted to talk about his lawyer for a minute, so let's continue with him.
Well, so I have litigated against that lawyer and his law firm many
Exactly.
times. Um, they handle they do represent President Trump. They actually represent him in the Brian Sicknick lawsuit that I have
Oh,
with
really? I didn't know that, okay.
yeah. But other than that, they generally did not represent Trump. They would represent what I will style as like second, third tier MAGA people.
Right, right.
Rick Grinnell, Michael Flynn, Kash Patel. They took over a lot of the cases that Devin Nunes was bringing because his lawyer had a stroke or
Right.
some serious medical ailment that he couldn't continue.
This
And
would be our
so,
friend like Fred Wellman and Rick Wilson and
yeah,
those guys, yeah.
yeah. Again, so they were both of them were sued by Flynn. I represented Fred Wellman. In the middle of the case, they
Right.
just abandoned it. They just walked away conveniently after I filed multiple motions for sanctions against
Mhm,
them. Rick Grinnell sued Olivia Troy,
mhm,
and we were on the eve of trial, and they
mhm.
dismissed the case. They just walk away. A year later, they refile. We've defeated the case twice. The
Right.
vast majority of cases that that firm has brought for in the MAGA sphere, they have either abandoned, lost. Every once in a while, there might be a settlement, usually because there's an insurance company that might be involved, and
Mhm.
they're just rolling numbers and doing statistics, has nothing to do with the merits. But it is nothing less than an intimidation tool. Hey, it stresses out people. It's not fun being
Exactly.
sued,
It exactly.
and it costs a
The
lot of
mm.
money.
It's a resource consumption and it's a bandwidth consumption on so many levels for people that, they when they prevail, are still worn out.
Yeah, it
Yeah.
takes a toll without a doubt. And this case, there's no way it's ever getting to discovery. I mean, they would be foolish. For one thing, I guarantee you they would have. I can't say make guarantee because I cannot make promises, and I can't. It's impossible to predict these guys. But
Sure.
he's a public figure. He's a public official. He's got to prove malice. There's no way he's going to be able to do that. The standard is just too high. There's a reason why individuals at his stature, by way of title, do not bring these types of cases.
Mhm.
Plus the fact that their truth is the best defense.
Mhm.
And this is nothing but an intimidation factor. But the fact is that there are aspects of it that worked or that always work. For example, Dan Abrams in his Sirius XM POTUS show, which I
Mhm.
enjoy very much, been a guest before. I like Dan a lot. He's one of the more astute lawyers on air.
Yeah.
Always enjoyed listening to him. He was supposed to have the author of the article on his show yesterday. The article
Mm.
came out Friday.
That's right.
She had to cancel because of the lawsuit. So there's an impact right there.
Yeah.
Even though the Atlantic is standing steadfast behind her, this case will be litigated.
Noticeably they are, by the way. I keep seeing new posts of the exact same
The
story.
exact, yeah, yeah. I noticed the same
I'm
thing.
like, I got 3 emails
Yeah,
about the same story?
the
They've
same
never sent
article.
me
Push,
3
push,
emails
push.
about the same story.
Yeah, yeah. You wouldn't see that if you didn't believe
Yeah.
in your sourcing, and I
Yeah.
don't have any doubt. I know the author. I
Well,
don't have any.
let's go to something you would know about in this, area that I again appreciate your wisdom on this, is that the standards and legals in, both the, uh, print media, television media, and book media is a big deal. People don't know how much, people who'd been in the military or intelligence or public office have to go through, hoop after hoop after hoop to get published, and you've been in the middle of that work with people. Yeah.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'll handle classification review of
Hmm.
cases all the time, including I rep two of Trump's first secretaries of defense
Right.
in the first administration. Is one of his national security advisors. But routine CIA case officers, Department of Defense officials, I help them get their books out all the time. These types of articles, especially knowing that Trump and those in his circle sue so easily at the
That's right.
drop of a hat. They also make threats that they never follow through on.
Sure.
They do that a lot too, probably more often, quite
Sure.
frankly. But these articles, these types of articles, go through intense legal review to make sure that there is proper sourcing, and they're willing to take the hit because they're not hopefully going to be intimidated. Unlike CBS, unlike ABC, unlike the law firms who settled and
Right.
capitulated, because all of those decisions are frankly not substantive. They're not concerned about the facts. They were concerned about money, right? They were concerned about mergers. They were concerned about FCC issues, things like that. The Atlantic clearly, the Atlantic has become, in my view, I would say, without taking away from many other great journalists and publications, has become like sort of one of the leading media outlets out there that are holding this administration's feet to the fire.
Yeah.
I'd put the Wall Street Journal up there as well,
Yeah.
more so than ever before, which is fantastic to see because it's not about being part.
True. Let's go for this. Something there's your specialty, and I actually am working on almost a book level research on this with GRU Unit 29155. So the anomalous health incidents, some people think of as the Havana syndrome, but you so perfectly corrected that it needs to be wider than that. What's the latest in that situation?
Yeah, in fact, I tweeted out on X today the latest I'll say my world blockbuster news. I represent a whistleblower at the Department of Defense who filed
Hmm.
a detailed 10-page
Mm.
whistleblower complaint about waste, fraud, and abuse and national security threats involving AHI, and we filed it with the Department of Defense Inspector General's office last month. And just last week, out of the blue, we get an email that says they've closed the case. No action, no warning, no interview. They didn't even
Mm.
ask for additional information. They just shut the case completely down. Don't know why. I'm sure we'll ultimately find out why, because it's not
Mm.
going to deter us from going forward with more information. But this case of anomalous health incidents, I think we are moving closer and closer towards identifying who the culprit is. The
Mhm.
unit you mentioned, it's Russia. And we'll get at some point where the U.S. government, I think, will acknowledge it. It
Mhm.
is like right beneath the surface. If you think of an iceberg, only like a third of an iceberg is above the surface. The real damage
Right.
is down below. That's what sank the Titanic. It hit the
Right.
iceberg beneath the water line, and because of the classification aspect of AHIs, most of which is within the CIA, which is keeping the cover up going.
Mhm.
We're building momentum. It's a bipartisan, nonpartisan issue. The members in the House who have been the most outspoken are Republican members on the House Select Committee on Intelligence, especially the chairman, Rick Crawford, who's putting intense pressure on the current DNI, Tulsi Gabbard. We'll see much longer she lasts, to push for more information, more transparency. This administration says it's the most transparent of administrations in history.
Transparently in the pocket of the Kremlin.
Yeah. So where's the AHI documentation? I know it exists because I've seen quite a bit of it. I've sat. The thing about my security clearance, what was so significant about revoking it, which I now have gotten back, they appealed. We have arguments next month. But the case that I use my security clearance the most is about AHIs. I go through, I participate in classified meetings all the time about AHIs. Not going to reveal, obviously, what's learned in those meetings, but I will tell you that were that information to be known, people would have different opinions about the topic.
Sure. Actually, I will say, as a person who has never held security clearance but eventually reads the unclassified documents on many cases, people misunderstand classification ultimately in a way that's kind of an on-off switch. If it's classified, it's bad, or and there are some that are actually odd, where a person in the military can't know something I, as a civilian, may have put together, and both things can be true. Yes, I can put it together, and the person in the military is still not allowed to look across that that document at all. Literally, just not allowed to do so. And there are reasons why it's wired in.
Yeah, all the time. I had a
Yeah.
case a quarter century ago where a client wrote a manuscript about China's nuclear weapons program. And he
Hmm.
had been the intelligence chief at Los Alamos National Lab, one of
Hmm.
our, where Manhattan Project took place. It's one of our key facilities about nuclear weapons.
Hmm.
And he retired. He had gone to China a dozen times to unofficial meetings, both
Hmm.
as a federal contractor and then as a civilian, as private, just by himself, or as a academic. And he would be given tours of China's nuclear weapons facilities by the
Right.
Chinese.
Right. Right.
Now, because he was loyal to the United States, every time he would come back from China, he would come to DC. He would brief the Department of Defense and especially the Defense Intelligence Agency about what he heard, what he saw. Here's my notes, things like that. So then he writes a book, and
Hmm.
the Pentagon flips out. This was a front page Washington Post story from I want to say it was in 2000 or 2001. I can't remember. It's
Hmm.
too far back from my head. But they flipped out. And I even had friends of mine in DIA tell me, Mark, what are you doing? This is so highly classified. And I'm like, it is for you. It's not for him. He didn't work for the federal government. I mean, the CIA used to do this,
Exactly.
especially in the 50s and 60s, because we
Yeah.
didn't have access to the Soviet Union. Who did? Businessmen. So every
Right.
time a businessman went over, a lot of times they got debriefed or interviewed by the U.S. government. What'd you
Right.
see? What's their manufacturing capacity?
Right.
What are the lines? To get food. What good shape are the bridges in? Things like that.
Yeah.
And when it came into the government, the information would be classified. So
Yeah.
anyone who learned it inside the government could not lawfully share it. But if you were outside the government and you gave it to them, you can do whatever you want with it.
It's a strange thing. I don't know when I determined this. It was a decade ago or so, but things that carried that sort of condition became more apparent the more I was uh, as a civilian researcher of terrorism infiltrating in things, which brings me, as we close, and we'll say we've got our next 2 hours is coming up. Stay tuned, get your coffee. Just kidding. This is our last question for tonight. You actually juxtaposed the Project Veritas and O'Keefe Media with the news from AP that Southern Poverty Law Center says it's being facing an investigation from Department of Justice over past paid informants to infiltrate extremist groups. Now, I qualify as the unpaid informant. I could just get in the shit. Um, but the fact that they're waging lawfare on that, and then you see like the O'Keefe example, I think you so perfectly brought that up, and maybe we should draw a line about the fact that I am not really obligated by the Fourth Amendment to do what an official of the state does, and why there's a difference between the two.
Yeah. And people never they never seem to realize, if you say something and somebody tells you to, hey, you need to be quiet, and the person goes, you can't stifle me. That would be a violation of my First Amendment right. No, it wouldn't be. If the New
Hmm.
York Times doesn't publish your op-ed, that's not a stifling of your First Amendment right, because they're not the government.
Right.
They can decide. This is why if you work in a company and you want to say something, the company can say, I'm going to fire you as a result. Example I always gave, I always thought it was kind of funny. Some guy went online and did a YouTube video. He wrote a song criticizing Starbucks, just slamming Starbucks. He
Right.
worked at Starbucks. He got fired. That's lawful.
Yeah.
What if the government did it? And we have litigation actually right now about that, where, for example, people who got fired because they said something negative, perceived negative or negative, about Charlie Kirk in the aftermath of his
Right.
tragic death. And the government fired people, or victims that I represent of O'Keefe's undercover operations, where they got secretly recorded on dates, private, just dates, single people going on dates.
Correct.
And then they post it online, and the person says, "Oh, I don't like the Secretary of Homeland Security. She's a piece of shit." Okay, that's fine. You're allowed to say that. You don't give up your First Amendment rights to be a federal employee.
Right.
Can you go out and make a speech to say that? I wouldn't advise it. But can you tell that to friends, family, straight?
Right.
Can you just be in a conversation with someone? Of course you can. Um, and this notion of what the Southern Poverty Law Center, which used to work with law enforcement all the time
Yeah.
about extremists, right? Remember when extremists were bad, militias were bad,
Right.
white
Then they
nationalists
bought a
were
platform called
bad.
X.
Yeah. And right, they would be banned from, right. So X is a perfect example. When it was Twitter, it's a private company
Yeah.
then, or now. And they could stop whoever they wanted to. They can set the standards. That's how come they kicked off President Trump. You didn't meet our standards. Well, if the Southern Poverty Law Center is now being criminally investigated because they're viewed as being more left than this administration, uh, the notion of what they're trying to do. O'Keefe uses this as an argument
That's
against
right.
me all the time, that I'm trying to stifle undercover journalism. Um, I'm not. I represent tons of journalists. I'm all for undercover journalism. There's still rules, right? A journalist can't break into, not saying O'Keefe did
That's
this,
correct.
you can't break into a house, right, to
That's
take a
correct.
document for the story. My view, and there are journalists and lawyers who differ, you can't publish classified information. That's against the law. I do not support that. Ed Snowden, etc.
Right.
I repped. Um, who did I rep? I just forgot. I just blanked on their
All the cool people.
um,
That's what I like about you, bro.
Chelsea Manning. Sorry, Chelsea. I
Right.
just blanked on your name there for a sec as I get older. I didn't represent her when she faced the prosecution for giving WikiLeaks the information. I wouldn't have, but I did represent her when she wrote her last book and
Mhm.
submitted it for review properly, lawfully,
Right.
to
Right.
make sure there wasn't any classified information in the book. So, what the Southern Poverty Law Center is saying the Justice Department is doing to it now is, if I were O'Keefe and Project Veritas, I would be really concerned, because I'm not sure they can make a distinction other than partisan favor. And that's not a lawful distinction.
Exactly. Well, brother, I appreciate you. I mean, we're gonna have a lot more to cover between now and when fascism ends. Are you ready?
I'm definitely ready.
And as you know, I keep up with your cases pretty well, so that we can use the best of your wisdom. And if everyone in this room is not currently, we have 40 people in here watching right now. If you're not currently already subscribed to Mark's account here, make sure you are. Subscriptions are also good. And if you have questions about stuff we have had on here that maybe next time we need to build on, let us know. But I appreciate always what you're doing and a standard you set. That I think, especially when people are concerned that the law is falling apart around them, like how we're going to stop these out of control events. There are at least some people who know, well, wait a minute, there are at least some brakes and skids on the ground that show that we're trying.
Well, it's podcasts like this that also really help. Democracy flourishes in the sunlight, right? They say how it dies in darkness. So
Yeah.
being able to have these conversations for people to be able to learn about what's going on and to hear, what hopefully is the truth and accurate, which I certainly strive to do. That helps. So, thank you. I really appreciate the opportunity.
Appreciate you right back. Stay tuned. We'll see you soon, everybody. Good
Take
night,
care, everyone.
everybody. Слава Україні, героям слава і пиздець, Російській Федерації.